Welcome back to another episode of The Growth Guide. Today, I had the pleasure to talk to one of my friends, Brent Stevenson, author of Why We Hurt. Brent is a physiotherapist here in Vancouver, Canada. He specializes in helping people with resistant and chronic pain problems overcome their challenges. He has a non-traditional approach to helping his clients. He starts by teaching them about how their bodies work, and then approaches the process of feeling better with the mantra of education before intervention. In this episode, Brent shares profound insights into the mind-body connection, chronic pain management, and the impact of stress and anxiety on our physical well-being. Join us as we explore the transformative power of understanding and addressing the sources of physical and emotional discomfort, and the proactive steps we can take to cultivate a healthier and more resilient life. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. Brent, welcome to the show. Where we're going to start today with your book, Why Things Hurt, is with this paragraph. And then I'm going to hand it over to you and let you color things in for the listeners. Your posture is collectively how you sit, stand, walk, and move. It is how other people see you, but reflects your own genetics, experiences, traumas, and personality. It is how you're holding it all together. Can you take us through that?
Sure. I believe that was from one of the first sections I put in there of a lady named Joyce, who was a counselor I was treating. And I like to tell people that just because you can stand, sit, walk, and breathe doesn't mean you do any of them very well. There's a lot of things that people take for granted. We learn to use our bodies at a really young age as we're just growing and developing, where you have no real context for that anything could be any differently. And people, as a physiotherapist, people come in to see me and they're coming in, it's physical therapy. People are coming in for an injury or a pain and don't necessarily know why or what's happening to them. And so it's my job to help them understand why things hurt. And a lot of that comes back into, sure, maybe they fell and sprained their ankle, but a lot of times it's little insidious things throughout life that they've done in terms of how they're sitting at their desk all day, how they're standing at a counter all day, some of the stresses in their life, whether they had some traumas earlier in life. So it's more of all the collectively how everything holds together is what people need to start to appreciate about their body. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and let's expand on that with, let's stay with Joyce. So you wrote that for the first time, she came to recognize her thoughts and her physical body were somehow related. And hers seemed to be strangely conflicting. It was an aha moment she had to work out for herself. I couldn't tell her. So what was that realization she had? And how might that impact the listener who's listening with this idea that it may be our thoughts or the stress that we're carrying that is manifesting in physical ailments?
Yeah, so she was a very generally, I would say, pessimistic person. She would very didn't think she could change anything about her physicality. She was a long, lanky person. Her arms just sort of hung off of her body. She never really exercised or played sports and didn't really have much of an actual physical relationship with her body. She spent all her day trying to go through and work with other people's sort of psychological issues and problems and trying to prop them up, but never really sort of considered her own. And she had a lot of trouble just sitting at a desk all day because her back was slowly getting sore. And she didn't, in terms of it comes back to her posture and how she was holding it all together, she really did not do a very good job of actually figuring out how to stack up the bones in her body. And she'd sit and just hang from her ligaments. When she moved, her body was just this sort of collection of bones. And I slowly, over time, taught her how to move more efficiently in space, which involved her, stacking her skeleton up and moving. And it put her eventually into a much more assertive looking posture and condition where the way she conveyed herself to the world was a little bit more kind of apathetic and down. And she was much more of an introvert, and I taught her how to efficiently stack things together and move around, and that slowly over time equated to her pain going away. But then she was physically holding herself in a way that didn't necessarily match up with her more passive nature, and she started to the aha moment was when she started to realize how she could start to take control of that, and she started getting into Pilates and learning about just being more assertive in her own health.
So then her behaviors and her mindset and the way she portrayed herself more assertively started to tie to the posture that she was now carrying around.
Yeah. So you could see it in how she held herself, that she was more assertive with it, and also like part of it, a lot of her pain was, and I say throughout my books how people tend to hold their day-to-day tensions in and around their muscular systems and some of their deeper seated anxieties or stresses or fears in around their organs, and namely your heart and lungs are a big place in your chest where your body will hold on to tension, and the muscles into your upper traps and some of the deep muscles in your bum are areas where your body will just start to create a bit of a bracing tone. So I helped her start to realize how some of that sitting talking with people all day was starting to be a bit triggering for her, both physically and biomechanically and emotionally. I went through and released some of the muscles in her body, and it could make her feel better, but she kept coming back being this regenerating source of tension. And over time, teaching her how to be biomechanically more efficient and realize what some of her stress triggers were, she started to tune into why and how she was feeling uncomfortable.
So let's check in on that brain interface, because there was something you wrote that I hadn't heard before that I want to explore a little with you. Is this idea that when we have an acute injury, which often is what ultimately brings us in for physiotherapy, one of the things that you point out is we continue to blame the acute trauma, but you point out that nerves spend 2 to 6 weeks relaying messages to our brain that something isn't quite right. But even after the tissues have healed, because we've been sending those signals, the brain continues to tell us that something's hurt when the healing may have already occurred. So how does that work, and how do we overcome that glitch in our brain muscle healing interface?
Sure. Yeah, that's really a fundamental part of just the process of physiotherapy, is helping people understand that we're really just this big collection of sensory feedback loops. We have nerves that help that go to our skin that help us sense hot and cold and sharp and dull. And there's nerve fibers that are specifically for pain. So if you roll your ankle and sprain it and actually tear some of the tissues in the fiber, some of those nerve roots are going to get up to your brain saying, hey, worry about me, worry about me. And for good reason, because you do have some structural damage or some injury in there. And over about 4 to 6 weeks, your body will sort of knit those back together and remodel it. But over time, the need for your body to worry about that gets progressively less and less, but we start to get, what was I going to say? Our nervous system will start misinterpreting some of these sort of mechanoreceptors and all the little other muscles and tendons and joints around that area as a noxious stimulus when they don't necessarily need to be. And it starts just to create a hypersensitivity of it. So your body will start to, where there's not necessarily a structural injury, the muscles in that area can start to create an increased tension or an increased tone, which will make them act functionally weak. They'll start to restrict a joint, and then that can start to have a biomechanical effect on other parts of your body when something's not moving very well. And depending on how you actually emotionally related to that initial injury, sometimes hurting yourself just can be a scary thing. Pain can create fear, so your body subconsciously gets scared of it and gets overly protective of it. Over time, our nervous system is a plastic system. It does change and alter and adapt to the forces we put on it, both physically and emotionally. So once something has actually structurally healed, you have to start getting to use something and move it again. And that's where some of the exercises in physio go that helps your body habituate to that hypersensitivity and start to learn where it can start to ignore some of those sensations as opposed to subconsciously sort of double down on that protectionism.
So working with your medical practitioner or physiotherapist, you want to get back to action as quickly as you can in a safe way versus letting that mental, hey, it's injured, you can't use it, like actually overcome that by using it and getting back on the field or back in the game of play.
Yeah, and there's things, pain's relative. So there's a lot of times people, they might actually acutely hurt themselves and it really hurts to start with, and then they'll get past 3, 4, 5 weeks and it doesn't necessarily hurt in there anymore, but it still doesn't move very well, but your body will slowly compensate around, say, an ankle that doesn't move very well by adjusting maybe your posture or moving in your hip differently. And that subtle restriction that might not hurt actually, that limitation of movement can have this trickle on effect that keeps affecting you mechanically down the line, which is where one of the main sort of interventions I do use with people is called IMS, or intramuscular stimulation, which does, it's like an anatomy specific form of acupuncture, where it does use an acupuncture needle to go into a stiff, tight tonic muscle. It can help your nervous system start to let that go and sort of go back to a normal resting state, which can really help people. You get a really reflexive relaxation of muscles and help people feel more what normal is supposed to feel like.
The something you talked about in there with hips and flexibility, you wrote about something that was interesting to me because it was the first time I'd heard it. And I think similar to you, I tend to be very stiff, very sore after I play sports, but oddly, relative to the average person, am much more flexible than they are. And so you talked about this idea of hypermobility and the range, if you will, or spectrum of mobility and the implications that has on how we carry ourselves. And I guess how our body relates during physical activities and the implications on injuries or physio implications. Can you talk about that spectrum of mobility and how that interplays with the conversation we're having today?
Sure. I didn't realize until I was already into my mid-20s and been a physio for a few years and had the opportunity to actually poke and prod and move other people's bodies around that I was actually really quite loose jointed myself, or what he'd call being hypermobile. I wrote an article in my first book and on my blog, whythingshurt.com, years ago, called Being Hypermobile, a Gift and a Curse Wrapped into One, which everybody sort of sits on a spectrum of how much of a protein called elastin that we have in our tissues, which it really will dictate the overall extensibility of your soft tissues, like your tendons, muscles, and ligaments, which the more elastin you have, the more effectively loosey-goosey you are, the more loosely you're held together, and the less of it, the more relatively stiffer your joints are. Being hypermobile does inherently make you a bit more flexible, and it might sound like a good thing to be relatively more flexible, but there are definitely pros and cons to it. Because you do have about 200 different bones and joints in your body, and when everything's more loosely held together, it's a much more challenging biomechanical task to actually physically hold it all together. Over time, when everything's really loose jointed, people tend to develop bracing strategies to just help hold and stack things up together. So you get people that have done a lot of like dance or ballet or gymnastics. Usually the more loose jointed people start to gravitate towards movement-based sports and things that do require flexibility, but they tend to develop these real postural imbalances and strategies where they'll develop sway backs and really tight muscles in their hips. So, and even though they are way more flexible than people, because they've developed these bracing habits, they actually end up feeling more stiff all the time than their hypermobile counterparts, because our muscles are supposed to have a certain amount of resting tone to them. They shouldn't be these limp, flaccid things, and they shouldn't be sitting there overly contracted. both due to postural strategies and due to emotional stress and tension, our muscles will hold on to and create a certain level of resting tone. And when that tone gets too high, it gets very compressive on your joints, and which gets very uncomfortable, and it can start to translate into pain and stiffness, or certain joints don't move very well, it starts getting uncomfortable. So it ends up being one of the first things I'm screening for when I'm going through an assessment with someone, is looking how loosey-goosey they are, because the stiff people, you can kind of just loosen them up and they feel better. The more hypermobile people, you can loosen them up, they feel better, but then you really genuinely have to teach them how to move and how to hold it all together properly, because otherwise they're just how they go through their day, and they're just have very inefficient movement strategies, and they just keep getting these little re-injuries and pains that make them uncomfortable.
And so if you're someone who falls into that category, should you be looking at even just a physio assessment to say, hey, like, how am I bracing all the time? How am I holding my tightness? If you're someone who does feel like all the time, like, oh, I am tight, I'm carrying a lot of stress or tightness in my shoulders or my legs and getting headaches, like, is that something you should be getting an assessment for?
Yeah, no, it's people really don't like. People are more prone to seek out help if they did sort of mechanically do something, like they bent over and they hurt their back, and it's just not going away, and then they'll come in to try to problem solve it. But life is inherently stressful, physically and emotional, on people, and we are actually recently wrote an article on my blog called "You Are a Regenerating Source of Tension. Learn Why," and that comes back both to the posturally, how we're sitting and standing, but also the role of having a bad boss at work, or getting in a fight with your wife, or dealing with teenage kids. All of those things are inherently stressful, and your body will start to hold tension and tone into muscles, into particularly in your upper traps and those deep muscles in your bum. And you can just be this sort of slow pressure cooker that starts getting uncomfortable. And tell people you kind of need a bit of a steam release valve every so often. So you can come into physio or go to a chiropractor or see a massage therapist, and that can help let some of the tension go. That when you're ready, you really should learn some of the things you're doing that are actually creating those regenerating sources of tension. Some of them are physical, and some of them are more physical and emotional. So yes,
Yeah,
having an assessment is really helpful. Yeah.
I want to zone in on that emotional side, and specifically stress and anxiety. So I'm going to read you a large passage that you wrote, and then pass the torch over to you to explain to the listeners what we're talking about here. Because a lot of what I picked up in reading your book is this emotional impact of stress and anxiety on our bodies. And so the passage was, I've noticed an ever-growing problem of stress and anxiety in people as they try to figure out how to navigate their healthcare system while listening to the thoughts and stories of millions of other individuals. We've become overly connected, impatient, overwhelmed, greedy, intolerant, and less happy in a time when everything is awesome, all because we think too much. Take that one away. What are we getting at here in the implication for people?
Yeah, I mean, that's where I think part of the everything is awesome one. I think I put a quote in there from Louis C.K. I remember him years ago being on I think Conan O'Brien, saying like everything's awesome and no one's happy. But it really I've been a physio for 20 years now, and every year that goes by, particularly more in the last 3, 4, 5 years since the COVID times, I've seen the real driving force when you get to know somebody. I've seen somebody enough times and start to see what it is that's driving people to come in for physiotherapy, is the role that stress, anxiety, fear, and loneliness are playing in their lives. And they're not necessarily appreciating it. That particularly, I'm a good example of it. People that sort of, particularly people that come off as overtly laid back and casual and don't necessarily perceive anxiety cognitively. You can get through your day and feel comfortable and confident that you're doing everything. Sometimes your body can just be screaming at you otherwise. Like you don't necessarily, I see lots of people don't identify as an anxious person. because they don't feel or they don't necessarily think they're anxious, but they're holding all sorts of tension in and around their bodies. And it's that's where when I connected with Gabor Mate on his recent book on called The Myth of Normal, which gets into how sort of our current society and our life is not necessarily normal. Our body's responses to all the stresses we've put on them is normal, but with some of the situations we find ourselves in, whether it's sort of doom scrolling on social media or just being in particularly people sort of my age where they find themselves, I've got 3 teenage kids, I've got aging parents on one side, I'm running 2 multidisciplinary healthcare clinics, I'm working clinically full time, I'm sort of burning it at both ends. I feel like I can do it because I have the cognitive capacity, but I started realizing that I was getting really run down, feeling kind of sick for no particular, feeling kind of just ill, but not being sick. I was getting headaches, and I had things to kind of blame that on, but wasn't necessarily realizing my body was stressed. And I'm seeing that more and more with people having a hard time. People are changing jobs due to COVID. They've got financial stresses, and it's their bodies are holding on to tension, and part of that's in their muscular system, and a lot of that's in around their heart and lungs and the loops of their small intestine. And I've learned the techniques as a physio to feel that in people's bodies, both through using needles to tap into people's muscles and seeing how their nervous system responds. I've taken probably 15 courses in what's called osteopathic manual therapy and something that's called visceral manipulation to just feel the tensions and pulls, what different organs in your body and how they're impacting your alignment and your movement. And when you get a chance to actually get to see somebody and talk to them for like a half an hour once a week for a long period of time while feeling their bodies, you can see these roller coasters of emotion manifested physically. I've gotten quite good at releasing that tension. I call it like a steam release valve. I can make you feel better, but I'm part of this, my more recent book. My first book was called Why Things Hurt, Life Lessons from an Injury-Prone Physical Therapist. My current book is called Why We Hurt, Understanding How to Be Comfortable in Your Own Body. And I've just really noticed this disconnect in how people are having a really hard time feeling uncomfortable, not necessarily always in pain, but they're uncomfortable or tense or anxious. And what they're feeling is the physical manifestation of their emotions.
When you think about that, I'll even use me as an example on this one. I've probably in the moment, I have the most change going on in my life I've ever had. We've had a family member, my father-in-law just passed away, selling our house, buying a new one, leaving a job, starting a new job, starting multiple businesses all at the same time. And during all of this, I've probably had a migraine for about a month. And so hearing what you say about how the tension just turns into headaches and physical anxiety and stress, when a listener's hearing that and I'm hearing it, how do you get through to them when they're your clients? Hey, look, like these things that are happening to you, these changes, these life situations, hearing you say it right now, it makes sense that it would manifest itself and it's contributing to the headaches or the issues I'm having. What would you say to the listener who's in the same situation on how they deal with it? If going into physio, that's one way, going in and seeing someone like you, Brent, who can help us release it. What about counseling, or are there other things they can do at home to release the steam valve?
Yeah, and that's where I would say I've gotten better at identifying it and calling people on it earlier in the process than I probably used to. And a big part of it is not everybody is immediately going to sort of identify as that's the issue. And that's the big tenet of my current book is there's layers of knowledge you have to sort of impart to people to help them not take it defensively and you telling them it's all in your head. I find it's people are pretty aware that they have stress, but not necessarily what that experience of stress is. So I find the book is full of just stories of how I've interacted with people through this through this to let them tell their story and see where they're at. And then a big part of it is giving them some physical treatment first to help them start to feel better, and then start layering on little bits of information to show them what, help them see what some of the things are that are the creating the regenerating source. For people with headaches like yourself, there are, as I said, our emotional center really is our heart and our lungs. That's where you'll take on a lot of physical strain. So your heart sits in your chest in a bag called your pericardium, which has ligaments that attach to the inside front part of your sternum, the upper or the lower base part of your neck, and into your mid back, just sort of above your diaphragm. And then it's wrapped in your lungs. I like to show, I have a big poster in my office that shows people how big your lungs are. They actually start above your collarbone, this little space up here, wrap around your heart, go all the way down into the lower part of your rib cage and your back. It is an area where your body will hold tension. There's the saying sort of it's tugging at your heartstrings. Well, there are ligaments that attach your heart. There are literal kind of heartstrings. And if you had a lot of like your bronchial tubes, which are where your breathing pipe, sort of your trachea goes here, bifurcates into two breathing pipes that goes to your lungs. It's an area where people hold a lot of grief and loss. And it's like someone grabbing onto you and trying to pull your head into your body like a turtle. If you get used to understanding and feeling what it feels like on the different tensions as a physio, I can pull your head and try to stretch it and see where things are pulling back from. A lot of headaches, the tension, particularly migraines and stuff, are more coming from tension into your chest and your upper back. And I can go in deeper into the anatomy of it, but that might get a little bit too much. But I will go through and explain some of that to people with anatomy and posters. And then I find the quickest acting thing from an intervention side is doing IMS dry needling, where these upper trap muscles tend to be, they're the thing that are usually creating part of a tension-based headache in the neck, but they're tug-of-war buddies with the muscles in your pecs and your lats. So those muscles around your upper back are all sort of tug-of-war buddies. When they get really tense, it's like you're wearing a little shrug sweater that's too small, and it gets very compressive on your ribs and tension into your neck. And those guys can irritate nerves in your head. Going through and just actually loosening those can seem like magic for people. It takes a lot of pressure off of it. And those muscles are and can be a regenerating source of tension that can get you uncomfortable. But you can really let that off first. And then that's where doing some, again, with the visceral manipulation, can get hands on the front and the back of someone and start to push and press into around their heart and lungs and get them doing some breathing exercises. It's not that I'm taking a lung and trying to move it from position B to position A. It's you can access the tension that you hold in that, help you feel it, help you breathe through it, and help you start to let it go. And it helps a person feel some of their emotional tension that they're holding and helps it let go. And the combo of those two things together can really have a lot of release on things like headaches, migraines, neck tension, upper back pain. And sometimes that's just relief, and a person will go, move on, they'll come back. And I've taken people that have had migraines and headaches for years and gotten rid of them, but it doesn't mean they're like I've cured them, then they can't come back. You can have stressful life events and it starts to come back again. And after it's a process. It's not like an intervention. It is therapy where you start to feel and see that, and you see that someone like myself has the capacity to make you feel better and take that away. And then it keeps coming back and keeps coming back. That's where you start to get some motivation to start making some lifestyle changes that might have the longer term impact. Does that answer your question? I kind of got off topic.
Yeah. I think I'm booking in to get some needling in my shoulders and neck. So you'll probably see a booking request come through.
I'll tell you, because I probably about 4 or 5 years ago, I started getting migraines, and I'd never had migraines before. I get into it. I talk about it a bit in my second book. My first book, The Whole Ordeal, is in there, but I had a really bad eye injury, and I got a hockey ball in the eye and ended up having to have 7 eye surgeries and just flipped my world upside down. I've still lost a lot of vision in that, but the product of going through all of that gave me a lot of headaches, which were not necessarily migraines, a lot of headaches. And for years, I kind of blamed all my headaches on that. And then eventually started getting ocular migraines, which I didn't know what was happening. I just didn't actually get that much of a headache, but started getting like the jaggedy lines in my eye all of a sudden. And I looked at words, and some of like I could see only half the words were there in a sentence of looking at a book. I was like, oh, this isn't good. And then it would last for 15 minutes. It would slowly fade away. I'd get a bit nauseous and get a bit of a headache. And I was okay. I was functional. But then the next day, and sometimes for 2 days, I felt like I had a concussion. Like I was not functional. I couldn't go to work. That really started to make me start like, okay, I got to do something about this. This isn't okay. And meanwhile, I'm trying to help treat other people all day and trying to figure out what's like. And I'm like, I've gone through a lot of periods through all my eye injury stuff where I've definitely been in more pain or more discomfort than the people I'm trying to help. So I started trying to check in with myself. I'm like, okay, I got to start doing something different. And I started noticing the recipe of what gave me a migraine, and that's when I started making little bits of life changes that started. It was usually, and I just listened this morning to your podcast about stopping drinking, which was interesting. But I noticed if I'd gone out with some friends and had a couple nights in a row, or I'd had a couple too many drinks, which equated to me not sleeping well. And then I had a lot of things at work I was just doing way too much. And so not in that day, but I'd say cumulatively over a week or two, where lots of work stress, didn't sleep very well a few times. And then the atmospheric pressure changed. Those planets colliding, if it went from a high pressure to low pressure, I could have no stress that day, but the cumulative effect of those things, bang, I'd get a migraine,
Bang.
and then I'd
Yeah.
be out for a day or two. And I started noticing that pattern, and I started figuring out means of starting to try to address some of the things that were creating different stresses in my life. And I've gotten them to be way more few and far between. It wasn't necessarily somebody physically treating my neck and doing things, although that's helpful. It was me starting to make lifestyle changes that started my migraines getting under control.
Yeah, a big one you wrote about was this idea that you felt like it was your brain telling you, I need a rest. And so I'm assuming introducing a bit more rest into your life would have been one of those things that you introduced. And at the same time, I know a bit about you, Brent. I know your
Yeah.
kids. I know where they go to school, the sports they play, the businesses that you run. And so I look at it and say, well, Brent, like, how did you introduce more rest into your life? What did that look like? Like, where did you slot it in?
Yeah, in principle, I tried. It had to be rest couldn't necessarily be I get to sit down and actually rest. It had to be partly my mental approach to things, partly I had to find my little moments, because we had 3 kids in 3 years. I have a 12-year-old, a 13-year-old, and a 15-year-old that all play multiple sports at a high level. I am running 2 clinics and working clinically full time. I have a dog and now 2 kittens, so work with and for me. So rest is not really, I wouldn't say it's necessarily rest. It was partly my approach to life, finding little moments of peace and little bits of time. One thing that I put the article, it's on my website and I put it in the book. One of the biggest functional changes that's made me more just engaged, and I've learned a lot through the process of it, was actually starting microdosing psilocybin. I learned a lot from the process of it, to the point where after retroactively having done it for a while, I realized that the state I think I was living in for years of going through just my head down and working to kind of get to where I'm at was putting me in a mild state of depression, I think, which I never realized. And that was part of my headaches, but seeing it from another side of where I found a bit more mental calm and started to have the capacity to appreciate just moments of putting some mellow music on and taking my dog for a walk through the cemetery, and looking at either not spending every moment listening to sort of intellectual podcasts and and listening to books, and just finding little times to be like, sometimes I catch myself doing that. I'm like, nope, I got to listen to music. And when I first walk in the door from work, I could have any level of family issues kind of come at me, and just trying to take my first few moments of coming home and just going up to my room and trying to sort of decompress and be ready to try to change gears. Starting to try to, as again, back to your podcast, I haven't stopped drinking altogether, but that picking and choosing how much or how frequently I'm drinking, and little things like I listen to Tim Ferriss's podcast all the time, and some of the Huberman guys, Huberman and Joe Rogan's, they're all constantly sort of advertising for that AG1 sort of athletic greens thing. I started taking that, and after about 3 years of hearing that ad enough times, I'm like, all right, I got to try it. And I found that made me feel better. So
But
lots of little
it
things.
tastes like ass, doesn't it? Like like, sorry, AG1. I don't know if you'll ever be a sponsor of the podcast. It just doesn't taste that great.
Honestly, I
Am,
thought it
am I
tasted
off?
better
Do
than
you
I
mix it with
expected.
something, or do you just chug it?
I found a lot of ice. A lot of ice.
A lot of
has kind
ice?
of it's kind of a vanilla-y, pineapple-y kind of. I was expecting. I've tasted some other green drinks that really were disgusting. I found their AG1 BDP not as bad as I
Maybe I'll
thought.
give it
So
another go. I have a big bag of it in my cupboard, and I gave it a couple days and thought, oh, I can't do this. Because I heard the same ads, and I thought, well, I've got to give it a go. I mean, I've been hearing this for 10 years. I gotta swill it down. So, Brent, you talked about your perception of why we hurt has changed over the last 20 years, and you talked a bit about it there. There's a big paragraph, a little bit of a TED Talk paragraph that I really enjoyed. So I want to read that and have you talk us through that evolution. And what you said was, to genuinely understand why things hurt, we must appreciate that how we think affects how we feel and view our bodies as the interface between the world and our consciousness. As I keep looking deeper for the root causes of the persistent discomforts in the people I help, I find empathy, kindness, and meaningful explanations are the groundwork needed before physical interventions can have lasting impact. Different forms of stress, fear, and anxiety fuel the regenerating sources of tension we unknowingly create and hold in our bodies. So physical treatments alone have a slim chance of getting to the root of the problems. And this seems like what we've been talking about most of the time, but do you want to expand on that a little bit more?
sure. Well, I don't think like the concept of a mind-body connection is an overly new thought, and that's where like you've I've read like the body keeps the score and the way out, and the when the body says no, and I resonated with a lot of them, but didn't necessarily. I hesitated necessarily recommending them to a lot of my clients because I found that they couldn't. They some people would have the capacity to really connect with the message of them, and some really need it to be a bit more meaningful because they're coming in for help because maybe their elbow hurts or because their back hurts or because they're getting a migraine. And so I try to wrap my explanations around what the person is experiencing. And they're coming in with a thought of that a connection to a physical part of their body, not necessarily that they're not coming in. Well, actually, more people now are coming in because they know they're stressed, and they know they've been referred from a friend and I've helped them. But most people are coming in because of some physical thing is meaningfully getting in their way. So I'd say one of my biggest strengths as a physiotherapist is starting by giving the person the time to tell their story to me, and then me helping them make sense of it anatomically first, and then making the leap to how or why our nervous system works, both from how our brains work a little bit, and how or where we hold on to tension and why, and help them see that interface between your muscular system and your visceral system, and then actually be able to back that up by doing something to them physically that makes them feel better, and then telling them like this isn't necessarily your fix. You might feel better now, but like this might last for 5 or 6 or 7 days, and then it's best if you come back in about a week and we can try to do it again. And you see people about like every week for 3, 4, 5 weeks, you start to get to see how their body responds to the physical things I'm doing, which is that at the heart is what keeps them coming back in a little bit, because I can give them some relief, but it also provides me the opportunity to teach them the things that I think they need to learn about themselves. Some people are open to that and you can tell them right away. Some people, like somebody walks in, they're super stressed and they're strung up, and they don't have time for you to tell them that they're stressed. Like, you just got to make them feel a bit better. I have literally treated people this, like I've had clients for the same people for 15, 16 years. I've seen them through dating, marriage, kids, divorce, and treated the same, like say 3 generations of the same family. And you can get to see the emotional side of and like what a person's pattern is. I've known them long enough. They come in and I can give them that steam release valve. But then teaching them about how and why the emotional side of it comes in, that's again what you have to wrap it around something that's meaningful to them, which is tricky. And that's where you have to start by listening. You have to give a person a time to tell their story, which is really, unfortunately, what the medical system just does not have time for. A lot of people have at their heart anxiety, fear, stress-based things that are making them uncomfortable, and they're taking that into a medical system that is still pretty dead set on looking for physically something wrong with they're like, okay, your back hurts, let's start with an x-ray, let's look inside you, here's a CT scan or an MRI. And that's like taking a snapshot of a moving being. Like it's looking at a picture when you need a movie. You have to try to make sense of it over time. So because you don't have that much time in a medical appointment, usually you don't necessarily understand the story behind it. So you focus on symptoms and you're like, okay, well, this hurts. The medical system tends to focus overly on thinking pain relates to inflammation. Sometimes it's inflammation, but so it's usually the default is here's an anti-inflammatory. And there's an escalating level of pills and medications you can take that might make you feel better temporarily. And you can take pills for anxiety and you can take pills for depression. And people don't really want to take drugs usually. People don't really want to be injected with lidocaine or be cut open and had a surgery. But a lot of people also aren't really necessarily willing to kind of go down the mental rabbit hole of figuring out that story.
Yes.
We have busy lives. Like I have, so opening up the mental can of worms is harder. And when you have all your busy day-to-day stuff going on, it's hard to kind of figure out when you have the time for it. So I have to make a judgment call in the half an hour I have with somebody of what best serves this person. Do they just need me to make them feel better today and give them a little snippet of information? And then over time, I give them little bits more information. And then, I mean, the real reason why I end up writing this book is I rarely get the opportunity to teach one individual everything I think they need to learn, because I got them feeling well enough and they stopped coming in, or they ran out of funding to come in or couldn't afford it to come in, or they weren't necessarily, they got the gist and then kind of moved on. So for my own sort of mental satisfaction, I was like, I wanted to put it all in one place. That's how I started writing my whythingshurt.com blog. I was like, physiotherapy becomes pretty repetitive. You start making the same explanations over and over and over again to people. The point, they become like a comedian rehearsing his act. You start you start to see what explanation resonates with somebody a little bit better and better. And after a while, I wrote those explanations down, and that's how my whythingshurt.com blog started. And then after a while, I wrote enough of them, and I'm like, this kind of needs to be a website. And then I created all these movement-based videos and trying to teach people how to physically hold it all together. I'm like, it kind of needs to be a video or a video course. And then I'm like, and then after a while, I'm like, I think it more needs to be a book. So I eventually ended up kind of building all three. And that first book is called, which is the Why Things Hurt: Life Lessons from an Injury-Prone Physical Therapist. It more reads as a collection of blog articles. It's a great reading waiting room book because you can kind of pick it up and see well, this resonates with me, that resonates with me. It's not necessarily have to go through it. It's in a purposeful order, but I put that out like 8 or 9 years ago, and I would say it skewed my caseload of people coming into, because they found, I don't know, I self-published it. It found its way into libraries and all over the place, and people read it and started and came in to see me because they'd read that. And I'd say it skewed my caseload more towards people with chronic and resistant pain problems that have seen two physios, a chiropractor, massage therapist, four doctors, and needed a slightly different approach. So as when working, which inherently biases it to being more people that are experiencing a lot of stress and anxiety. And so I started doing more and more reading of things about mindfulness and mental health, and uh,
Yes.
which I learned a lot about myself and a lot about people. And then COVID happened, and it just kind of doubled down on everybody's stress. And so, in the same way, my first book, I'd started it before I had my bad eye injury, and after I ended up having 7 eye surgeries in a year, I'm like, okay, now I got the thing that pulls my book together. COVID was kind of the thing that pulled my new book together, because it really just put everybody in a boilermaker and send everybody coming in for physio being just super stress balls.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoy what you're hearing so far and want me to be able to get your favorite guests on this show, please do me a quick favor. Subscribe to the show and leave me a rating. The 30 seconds of your time will mean a ton to me. We were talking about it at dinner last night. There was a group of us, and we thought to ourselves, when you look back at that 2 years, I mean, the problem was none of us knew better. But when you look back, just the way we handled it in so many ways was just craziness, and the stress and anxiety that led to in people, like shutting everything down, hunker down in your house. You're not allowed out, like cancel all sports, cancel all activities. It's like everybody just became like a hermit overnight for 2 straight years. It was devastating on people's mental and physical health. Like it was just madness that we, and one of the guys at dinner, his brother was living in Florida, and he still remembers talking to him on the phone, and his brother saying, "Oh, like I've got COVID." And he's like, "Oh, well, where are you?" And he's like, "Oh, I'm just out for dinner." It was just like a totally different way of
Yeah.
handling it. Not saying that was necessarily the right way, but when you look back in hindsight, mental health wise, it definitely had a better impact on people than the way we sort of did that shelter in place and lock everybody up.
Well, I had a really interesting experience through it, because I run two big multidisciplinary clinics in Vancouver, and you started to see the writing on the wall, like, I think we're gonna have to shut this down coming here. And sure enough, we did. And it was leading right into spring break, and I was supposed to take my oldest son Matt down to Vegas or it was Phoenix or somewhere in the States for a baseball tournament, and that obviously wasn't going to happen. And it was my other son's birthday about 4 days later. I'm like, we got it. So I had to shut the clinic down. I'm like, well, we got to do something. And so like we have a cabin up in the Okanagan, which is about 5 hour drive away. We told the kids, like, throw some stuff in a bag. We're going to the cabin, and thought we were going for about 4 days, and we ended up moving up and living on the side of the lake for about 2 months while we had to shut the clinic down for 2 months, and ended up just having this slow pace of life where I sat on my, like, I did stuff with the family, went for bike rides. The weather was nice. We're living in this like orchard on the side of a lake, and it was actually the most period of time I've ever had off in my life. And I realized my headaches started getting better. I started feeling
Yeah.
I was like, whoa. And so it gave me a new perspective. And then when I started looking like, okay, we're going to have to open these businesses back up, I moved back into the city, and all these mandates, I had to create this whole big manual of all the new policies for protective equipment, and impart that off to all the people that were working for and with me, and then trying to get all the protective equipment and this or that. And then like, okay, I think we got it. And then invite the community to start coming back in, when we're now, after people have been hiding in their homes for 2 months, like I was like the first person somebody came back to see, other than maybe going to a grocery store. And they're like, tiptoeing back out of isolation, and everyone, you could just see, everyone had their own rules for themselves. They created their own levels of
100%.
anxiety. And like some people were like wearing 4 masks, had bottles of hand sanitizer in every pocket, and were like spraying the air in front of them. And they're in a small room with a person touching them.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
so,
yeah, yeah.
and so it was, I had to deal with my own approach to it, my staff's approach to it, and then just be pretty accepting to whatever the client coming in was willing to sort of to deal with. And you could just see and literally tangibly feel the stress in people. Again, I'm giving them a bit of the steam release valve by manually or needling them or whatever, but then trying to help them understand that this is your body's normal response, and kind of coach them through that progressively. And but it's still, there's the acute aspect of the post COVID kind of stuff, but now you're starting to see it. People are re-looking at their lives a little bit and still haven't figured it out. And it's still there's these physical manifestations of stress, anxiety, and fear that I'm sort of trying to help people treat and understand.
Yeah, I think two things are going to happen. We're going to continue to see the physical manifestation of that stress, anxiety, and fear for years to come. That really boiled up in people, and some people haven't learned to let that go. And then the second one you mentioned is very powerful, is a lot of us just use that time to question our lives and say, what am I doing? And is it what I want to be doing? Or do I want to make a change? Similar to how I talked about earlier about leaving a job, starting a new job, things of that nature, that all ties in. Those were all conversations that I had with myself through COVID of, am I happy doing what I'm doing, or do I want to be doing something else? And I mean, we're having this podcast because we had COVID, and somewhere in there I thought, hey, I'll start a podcast. You thought, hey, I'll write another book. And so some of us took that as an opportunity to re-examine life and say, let's make those changes. And one of the things you did during that time, which is interesting, you talked about it a little already with psilocybin and microdosing, is you started to explore altered states of consciousness. So how have you come to appreciate altered states of consciousness as they relate to our physical journeys?
Bring that back to, say, anxiety to start with. The anxiety that people really start to create, and the experience of chronic pain, it really puts blinders on people. You start to only see a small facet of the world, as the experience of being you is either sort of defined by this pain or this discomfort, and you can get very controlling of having to only do certain things to try to keep your brain at ease. And as part of my job, I see people with very broadly different approaches to the world. I have to kind of and can see the role that anxiety plays in different people's lives. And I would say I'd go back to, again, just initially starting with my eye injury. Like I had to go through a lot of physical pain, injury through that. And after all the different surgeries were done, I was just literally left with, it felt like someone had their hand on my head, torquing it, and this just tension-based pain in there all the time. And at that phase, I found just taking cannabis could really quickly make me uh, feel differently. Like I was working. I got back to work about 3 months after going through a lot in the middle of my surgeries, and I was helping other people with really bad double vision and just that. My kids were really little. I decided I to part of my motivating getting them going, I decided I was going to like coach all their sports just to keep me moving forward. And it was
I think you were coaching my kid in
I
soccer
coached
at
your
that
kid
time,
in
and I
soccer.
didn't
Yeah,
even know. So let's take
yeah,
a step back, because I don't think you've said yet what happened to your eye. So let's
yeah,
take people through, like, what was this injury? Because it's something you always hear could happen, and it
yeah.
actually happened to you.
The whole,
So
there's a bit.
let's talk them through that, and then go back into to where you were.
Sure. I think in the context of my journey, it does play into it. I used to I played ball hockey at a community center. There was a once a week kind of thing. A bunch of kind of young dads pretty much were in there playing. Very few of us were wearing eye goggles or protection, and I just, the guide to the backhander caught one of those hard orange ball hockey balls into my right eye, and I immediately was blind in that eye. And I had a single trickle of blood come down my nose, and I just couldn't see. And one of the guys I was playing with was a doctor. He's like, I think you got to take you to the hospital. It hurt. I've had more painful things in my life, but I couldn't see. I won't go into all the details of it, but I pretty much, if you get a blunt force trauma in your eye, it puts a shock wave of fluid goes through, and it blew a hole through my macula in the back, which is the center of your retina where you see detailed vision. So put a kind of a hole through that, and the impact of it pushes the eye down. I got an orbital floor fracture, so the bone that holds my eye up broke, and got triaged pretty quickly to the top retinal specialist, and they had a lot of blood behind my retina, which is why I couldn't see. I had 4 surgeries in 2 months of trying to help fix the retina, but they kept going sideways because the pressure in my eye kept going higher and higher and higher, and it felt like my head was going to explode. And to the point in my 3rd surgery, they put a valve on my eye that regulates the pressure in my eye, which literally brought me back to life. I was bedridden, lying on I could only lie on my side about 1.5 feet away from a fan with light wind blowing in my face. Otherwise, I would feel like my head was going to explode and I'd throw up for a long time. I got in and out of the hospital. They gave me shots of morphine until I passed out. Only way they could alleviate it was I had to sit my little chin on the ledge, and they'd stick a needle into my eyeball and drain fluid out of it, which was horrible, but incredibly relieving in the end. So I had a lot of trauma that went, just physical trauma, in and out of the hospital and surgeries and not feeling well. And at this time, my kids were 3, 4, and 6. So it was a lot. I ended up having to have surgeries, just realign my eye, surgery to fix the orbital floor part of it. So it was a kind of a year of hell and of physical traumas. But then after all the medical piece of it started to fall away, particularly in the Canadian healthcare system, like if you have an urgent issue, it's pretty good. They help you pretty quickly. You don't have to pay anything, and it's fantastic. But you start to notice when you don't have the urgent need, you start to fall into this medical purgatory kind of thing of you're not being seen, you don't know what's going to happen. And then you kind of left on your own a little bit. Nobody really told me what they thought my prognosis was going to be like. I had to kind of figure that out and kind of keep moving. That's where more of the mental struggles start to sort of take hold, which are harder to get through than the physical side of it. Like, it was excruciatingly painful, but after having a vitrectomy, which is where they take all the fluid out of your eyeball and they fill it full of gas, and then they tell you you have to lie face down for like a week afterwards, and the gas bubble pushes on the back of your eye if you're face down. When you've been through something that's really painful, it's then quite defeating to then just literally have to lie on your face for a week on the floor, which I did, and it went sideways. I ended up back in the hospital. But I laid on the floor there, and that was one of my first audiobooks. I got Ryan Holiday's The Obstacle is the Way, which is a book on Stoicism. And that was when I'm like, okay, well, I got to figure out how to turn this into something. I was still right in the middle of it. And that was when I was like, okay, when I had to drag myself out of bed, move back into my house, kind of re-engage with my family and kind of get my business going. Like, my income went to nothing because I was running this small business and kind of had to get that moving. And I found like my best way to keep moving forward was just keep doing. If I sat still, that was like you kind of avoided the getting in your head and the sort of the mental piece. So I slowly kind of grew my business and kept coaching sports. I went from coaching usually I was coaching 2 soccer teams, and then that soccer season ended. I coached 2 baseball teams. I did that for about 8 years, which I've now retired from. I did that. It was great. And I figured out, like, I knew the physio in me knew I needed to probably do some kind of exercises for my eyes to talk about the neuroplasticity of trying to figure out how to improve my vision. But like talking about earlier, how I don't have time for things. I'm like, life has to be my exercise. I gotta do things that are going to make this train and be in the right way. So I decided to coach baseball. I was like, one of my big concerns lying on the floor is, how am I going to throw ball with my kid again if I have no depth perception. So I decided to coach a bunch of little kids that could barely catch themselves and have them all throw balls at me until I figured out how to, which is probably not a great life choice, but it worked out. And I learned to do things like every little thing in life was hard. Trying to put a key in a keyhole was hard. Trying to pour juice and just missing the cup was hard. And trying to catch a ball was hard. And I slowly figured out my brain. I went from literally, if I was sitting here talking to you or a client in front of me, I'd have a sort of holographic, blurry version of your second head floating over your right shoulder and trying to concentrate on the real version of you. And over time, the neuroplasticity of my brain and because I just kept moving and doing things, it slowly learned how to better make my eye track and when to start to ignore the sort of compromised information it was getting from my right eye. To the point now, which is about 9 years later, my day-to-day visual experience is a lot more normal. I don't have in certain contexts, I still definitely have double vision, but it's a lot better. And that's because I kept giving it the opportunity to kind of habituate and understand and be plastic, and didn't kind of just mope that I can't see anymore. I kept pushing it and growing with it. And had a lot of mental struggle along the way, and that's where I connected with a lot of my clients. I learned from their experiences, and I did lots and lots of reading, and that's where more I understood some of the mental health side of it. That's where I started to appreciate some of the altered states piece, which with me on that related to eye injuries started with cannabis. It was that as uncomfortable as my eye and my head were, I came home from work every day with a really bad headache, and I'm sure I was grumpy, and I had a hard time. I'd find in that evening I could smoke a little bit of cannabis, and it didn't make the pain go away, but it took it from front and center to this back piece, and it allowed me to tune into different parts of the sensations in my body. So it gave me mentally a rest from the discomfort, which helped me with just start more thinking of consciousness of the experience of being you. Like, we really are just this big collection of sensory feedback loops. And just in order to walk and move and breathe, our brains have to have this default mode of ignoring most of it. And due to different injuries or pains or stresses, we tend to overly tune into certain areas that, like, after a long time, my eye wasn't structurally damaged anymore. It definitely wasn't what it used to be, but it wasn't an injury in there that was creating pain. It was sensitivities of different parts of my nervous system. And really quickly, cannabis made me just all of a sudden feel it in a different way that was more comfortable. That it was very relieving for me. And as an anatomy nerd and a physio, I feel like this is pretty fascinating. And that it really helped get me through a tough time. And then as further time went on, and I started working with and treating a handful of clinicians that were working in the psilocybin space, that were working in clinics that were helping people with sort of guided journeys for psilocybin. And I've always been a big fan of listening to Tim Ferriss. I read his first book, and I listened a lot when he started writing his blog, and then going through all of his arc of podcast, and just seeing the arc that guy's gone through, and sort of how he's become a big advocate of psychedelics. And I listened to him interview Michael Pollan and Paul Stamets a few times, and listened to not all of them, but a lot of them, and read Michael Pollan's book and read a whole bunch of different things. I was like, this is pretty fascinating, and particularly learning some of the history of it and how much research had gone into it in the past. And so that's when I was like, okay, I'm gonna try this. I'd had a few experiences before that were positive, but I'd never done it in a purposeful way before. And they talk about the importance of set and setting, like in terms of the mindset you bring towards it, and sort of in a goal-oriented kind of way, and sort of the environment you're creating for yourself. I just started doing it about twice a week for a while, and figured out. Initially I probably took a little bit too much. It was like, that's not really what I was looking for, and dialed it right down to a pretty small amount, to the point where I wasn't really feeling a lot of anything. Like I feel it just lightly, feel a little bit more engaged. Being outside was nicer. My body was just a little freer, but it wasn't like I was using it to try to have like a high experience. It just kind of connected me to the moment a little bit more, and it calmed down some of the chatter in my brain. I've got kind of a busy brain, and that's partly where my output of just doing. It you come back to that question of you asking me like, how do I get my rest? A lot of the rest I need is not necessarily lying down and stopping. It's just stopping. I listened to your other podcast with a person about they called it chatter. Yeah, the inner dialogue, and I found that it helped me with that. It just allowed me to kind of look and like, huh, trees are nice, and like flowers are pretty, music is nice, and which just to stop thinking of all the things I had to do for work. And it honestly, the part that got me the most was the not the day I took it, but the next day and the day after, I felt so much better. I felt like I was breathing better. I had generally had a better outlook on life. I just felt more comfortable, and I would attribute the experience of doing it for a while was the thing that really made me question. I was like, why do I drink alcohol? Which I can see. I know you're going through that, and then I haven't necessarily stopped, but I've like questioned and minimized it and sort of. I think generally think things in moderation are good if you figure out the context for them, and if it's made me question some of that, and it's one of the little lifestyle changes that's helped me come to get have less migraines. And the most interesting one, which is this is a case study, not any scientific research, but I said when I had migraines, I always felt like I was concussed for a day or two later. I found if I have migraine, if I go and I take a small micro capsule of psilocybin, I can go to work the next day, which none of the migraine medications that the doctor gave me came close to doing that.
That is powerful, and you and I talked about this while we were out the other night. And one of the big things for me is also bringing back, because I don't know about the average listener, but I found that over time I felt as if I stopped dreaming. But with microdosing the psilocybin, all of a sudden those vivid dreams of childhood were back. Where if I wake up, old man, got to go to the bathroom to go pee in the middle of the night, I would want to get back to sleep as fast as I could because I want to get back in that dream. And I hadn't had that experience probably for gosh, 25, 30 years. And so that was just joyous to be able to have those vivid, interesting dreams again, because there's something going on in the brain with the connections, because when we're dreaming, we're thinking and we're living. Like, it was just beautiful. I found that very, very wonderful.
Totally. I found my thought processes are always all over the place. I think my dreams were the same way, where I'd have dreams, but I could never explain them to anybody. Like my wife has these big long dreams. She could explain this whole dialogue of story that she could go through. I could never start by explaining what my dreams were like, because they'd start with one thing, bounce to another topic, bounce to another topic. But if I am in a phase where I'm more microdosing, it's like it calms that down, and actually you can get a storyline.
All of a sudden it is that
where
story.
Now I'm like, now there was a thing that I remember from there, as it has a story that makes sense that you could tell to somebody.
It's like a movie. You're like, oh, that was a fun movie. Like, can I get back into that movie? Can I? And you're like, I don't know if I could ever get back in, but there was that desire to.
And that's just inherently more restful. Like just because you're lying down in bed, doesn't mean your brain is resting.
That's right.
Particularly 100%. If you're working or on social media, doing things or watch stuff right until you go to bed. A lot of times people come in physio, they're like, oh, it's the worst when I get up in the morning. I'm sort of store. They look and like, I got to buy a new bed. I'm like, it's not necessarily the bed. Or people like look or talk about buying a new office chair. I'm like, well, you can buy a $3,000 chair and still just like slop yourself down on the front corner of it. It's more like, look at yourself. What is it that you're doing in the bed that's making the difference? So having routines before you go to bed, and having things that calm you, whether it's something like psilocybin, or just breathing practices or meditation, or just, I tell people you're best off to have both a physical outlet for your stress and a more passive outlet for your stress. Like something
Yes.
whether it's like you're going out and you're going for a walk, or you're going for a run, you're going to a exercise class, but you might hurt yourself, and maybe that you can't do it. And if that's your only outlet, and you don't have some mental way of calming yourself down, you can get yourself in a lot of trouble, and that injury is going to really affect you. But that's where, if you do have some type of meditation practice or breathing, or you do make the time to sit down and read or go out for a walk, that's something that's a little bit more on the passive side as a steam release valve. If you the two of you, your body and your brain need both of those, and a lot of times people will go all in one category or all in the other. So people come in and ask me for what should I be doing? What exercises could I be doing? And usually my first question is like, well, what do you like to do? People have this sort of passive guilt about they're not going to the gym. And I was like, well, if you hate going to the gym, don't pick going to the gym as being your means of getting fit. Like find a dance class or do something that you like, because you're way more likely to do it on a regular basis. And then acknowledge that your body is, like, as much as you might not feel stressed, everybody has stress. It's part of your life. So finding a lot of people, the people that need to find some level of meditation the most are the people that are the least likely to do it. So they have to find something that resonates with them that does provide those sort of outlets. And like, I'm not one to try to push like pills or drugs or things on people. A lot of people will take drugs and medications and things. I have found, just looping back for a sec to the psilocybin thing, it's the only thing I've ever taken that the process of taking it has made me learn about myself, and resulted in me opting to make healthier lifestyle choices. And I can just stop taking it for a period of time. If I'm feeling good, I'll just stop for a while. And if I start, then I start to know what the better, I start feeling better. If I start noticing life's getting me, I start starting to feel uncomfortable again. I'm like, oh, I'll do this again for a while. But it's not like something I just do all the time, but it's a tool you can use to help get yourself out of something, and then put yourself in a bit of a better mindset to then learn of whether it's do a breathing exercise, go to yoga, find some meditation, read a book, or learn about yourself.
So a lot of what we're talking about are tools people can have in their toolkit and ways to think and ways to behave. One of the big things you talk about and I advocate is this idea of personal responsibility and owning your health and your fitness and your mental or physical health journey. And so for you, with that personal responsibility, what should our listeners be thinking about? And what are a few of the actions that they should be taking on that physical and mental health journey to live their best life?
I equate that one back to not necessarily being an action, but partly a way of thinking about something. And this again is something that I start to talk about in the book in terms of your relationship to start with. I'm going to say this towards the medical system, where people have, as a physio, it's different in different parts of the world, but in Vancouver in particular, and I know in lots of parts of Canada, we don't have enough doctors. We don't necessarily have enough nurses, and people have this mindset that, and particularly more sort of our parents' generation of a doctor knows best kind of thing, of where we have to take the recommendations of our physicians, and the means of trying to fix the system is sort of put more money into supporting the doctors. And I work with lots of doctors. I think they're great. We need them. But there's this resentment in the system that our government needs to do more for us, our healthcare system needs to do more for us, our education system needs to do more for us. You could create this very elaborate healthcare system that is very enabling, but people need to take some personal responsibility in their own health and in understanding how to utilize the systems that are already available to them in how they reach out for help. So my first real answer to that question is learn what the role of your doctor is and what it isn't, like what they're capable of. Learn and try to build a team of people around you that you can reach out for help when you need. And a doctor is one of those. Someone like a physiotherapist can be one of those. You mentioned it in an earlier question. I don't think I really answered it, but like a counselor can or should be one of those. A life coach of something where you don't have to be seeing these people all the time, but building a network of people around you that you can choose for support or advice, whether it's just a needing a good friend or just particularly in times when you're feeling well, not necessarily in times when you're really just needing some kind of treatment or a pill or something to make you feel better. In the times you're feeling good, think about what that feels like and look out for creating a supportive network around you, and be open to seeing a counselor or talking about things. And if you don't know what you would necessarily say to them, start by reading books like my book, or throughout my book I put a lot of recommendations of other books in there, whether it's one on sort of like Gabor Mate's Scattered Minds book, or a really interesting one that was referred to me by a counselor client of mine who's called Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents. That one's an interesting read. Both that one and Scattered Minds sort of are good at contextualizing some of our stress triggers and how people get into some, like how ADD can be created, how some of our anxieties and our triggers are, just helping identify them a bit more in a contextual basis. There's endless amounts of information out there. Some of it can be distracting. I would say don't be shy about talking with your friends about the role that stress plays in your life, or that you're having health concerns, and just don't just hold it and save it and try to cram it into a 10-minute doctor's visit. Like, there's people that just sort of allocate their health chunk to when they can go see their GP. Like the GP has a great skill set, but there's like a lot of people go to them with the things that are they just don't have the knowledge base for, and then get kind of annoyed and disappointed that our healthcare system isn't looking after them. But you have to re-divert people to the people that really have the most experience and the knowledge about it, which for pain things is more physiotherapists. And a lot of people, and more so men, tend to experience their emotions physically more than cognitively. So might not have the words to explain what they're going through. So you go and sit down in front of the counselor and like, well, I don't feel stressed, and don't necessarily know where to start and talk about it. And that's where coming to understanding that and starting by reading or listening to my book, or coming to someone like myself and figuring out that connection between the physical and emotional might open you up to realizing how stressed you are, and then start to help you identify some of the things that maybe you could talk to a counselor or a friend or something about, where a lot of that happens in your own little community. That's how I sort of get towards the end of the book, is don't necessarily, and one of the quotes you read was about how people are paying attention to millions of people around the world, not necessarily seeing what's right in front of them.
Yeah.
So look at the people around you. Some of them can be more helpful than they probably are, and some of them might be people that you need to step away from. Like some of their good sort of friends or family members, you have to pick or choose whether they are good for you right now, and maybe take little breaks. Like you can have rest from a person, don't have to lie down and just rest, but you can curate your being a little bit more.
Yeah, it's a beautiful way to think about it, and gives me some perspective as we look at 2024. The intention I have is to live the best physical, mental life I can, and that's going to involve putting together a lot of those pieces of those teams. So I really appreciate that answer, Brent. I'm going to fire some rapid fire questions at you now, that the way we end each show. What's one book you've read that's had the most impact on your life?
I would say it was probably largely because it was the timing of when I read it. Would be Mindsight by Daniel Siegel, which is all about mindfulness. And I read that probably back in my mid-20s, right before I was a few years, maybe three or 4 years into being a physio, and it was just a couple of years before I started having kids. So I think just an age timeline at that age, you start realizing there are other ways that things could happen. There are different sort of, you can sort of tune into things don't necessarily have to be one way. And I had exposure to working with lots of other different people that had not been exposed to before. And you started to see the role of other people's physical and mental struggles. And it does a really good job of scientifically, in an approachable way, start to help people understand the role of mindfulness in their sort of physical and mental selves. And I'd say that put me on a bit of a trajectory of really starting to develop more empathy for people, understanding myself and understanding sort of other people's struggles.
And what's on the bookshelf right now? What are you enjoying taking down at the moment?
Right now, that's an interesting question because part of trying to launch this new book and me not having had a lot of time to actually sit down and read for a long time, I listened to a lot of audiobooks. And when I did listen to them, I bought the physical copy of them. And I have ones that I have read over the years, but they were all scattered all over my house. So I recently went through and found them all. Took them from probably 4 different shelves, partly because I took a bunch of pictures of them for my Instagram account at Why Things Hurt, and found a bunch of books that I've read years ago and haven't actually, and they were part of sort of informing me as part of this book. So, and I put them on a bookshelf that's we have a bit of a walk-in closet, and there's a little bookshelf right in there, and I stuck them all in there. So I actually see them all as I go in to get changed in the morning now, and I started pulling some of them out. So I would say at the moment, I'm not explicitly reading one. I'm kind of looking through a whole bunch of other ones, which was actually last night we had some friends over. I lent Gabor Mate's Scattered Minds to a friend who's looking at Anti-Fragile, which is
Nice.
which I found that one really interesting. And that's kind of how I opened this book, talking about helping people be anti-fragile, of sort of coming out better on the other side of an obstacle and sort of learning from your challenges and your troubles. So I've sort of flipped through that one again. The one that's actually literally on my bedside table right now, which I haven't really got into, I bought years ago and then ran out of time to read it, was Thinking Fast and Slow.
Yeah, I write about it a lot because a lot of people recommend it, and I found some fascinating things with it. But one thing I've never said out loud is I never finished the book. I think I got about 3/4 of the way through and thought, okay, I can't keep going. It's just not, it's too slow for me.
That's kind of where I think I fell at too.
Yeah, but there was some juice in it that I just thought, wow, fabulous. And I always come back to, and the main one I always come back to is this idea that our willpower is an energy system, and the example they give with the people applying for appeals. And if your appeal's being heard right before lunch hour or the end of the day, you're more likely to get denied. If you're heard first thing in the morning or right after lunch, you're more likely to get approved, simply because the person who's hearing your case has enough sugar still in their system and it's not depleted, so they're not hangry. And so you're getting your parole denied because someone's hangry. I mean, I always come back to that as just a fascinating facet. But other than that, I never finished that one. So you're not alone. What's one thing that Brent's bought in the last year for under $1,000 that you think, wow, I wish I'd bought this sooner?
Yeah, I was listening to a couple of your podcasts, and I was figuring you're going to ask me that, and it was an interesting question because I realized I don't buy myself very many things. I don't like stuff. I work a lot. I do a lot of things. I like doing things with people, but I'm not an early adapter in technology things. And my buddy last night, he keeps giving me a hard time because I've got a little iPhone SE, which looks like the old 6 iPhone, but it's actually, I think, an 11, but it's got the button, it's little, and he mocks me for having this little old thing. So I was like, what have I actually bought for myself? The thing I would say it came back to is actually earpods.
AirPods, they're a definite win. Yeah, hard to ignore.
Yeah, and that was at the pushing of I think my wife bought me an initial pair, and I was just like, I don't need AirPods, whatever. And I had earphones, but once I got them, I was like, oh, it
Yeah,
opened up
such
a new world
yeah, yeah.
of going out for like walking my dog and listening, and either listening to podcasts or books and or music, and it helped me find some downtime for myself that I just wasn't doing otherwise. So I would say it would be that was the answer I came to.
Well, I'll be wearing mine while I walk by your place with my dog in the next hour.
There you go.
It's on one of my most common routes, so that'll definitely a good answer. Because the show's about growth and personal improvement, what's one mindset shift, behavior change that you've had in your life that's had an oversized impact for you?
I would say honestly, it would be the active choice to start trying to make some time for myself. Like because of
Mm,
how busy I am, and that doesn't necessarily, that comes back to the rest thing of how not necessarily needing to stop and not do anything, but find the little I've questioned this, the what am I getting out of each of the things I'm doing? Of like what am I, we talked about this when we went out the other night, of that like I play hockey, and like what I'm getting, like yes, like it's exercise, but it's also some camaraderie, it's some downtime, and I end up, because of my life is so busy with driving my kids around everywhere and work, I end up missing it a lot, and realize I need it more mentally than I need it physically, but I also want it both for both. So really starting to, and I say sort of curate what my experience is I've had my head down trying to both feel better and just financially afford to live in Vancouver with 3 kids. But then sort of I've left my own well-being behind on that for a good part of it. So trying to carve out mental time for myself, and in order to make myself continue to feel well. And I get with just finding and prioritizing the things that are important to me, not just other people.
I love that answer. And Brent, we went pretty far and wide on your book today. Is there anything that we didn't cover that you want to make sure you get across to the listener?
I would say just what the overarching theme of what you'd see if you read my book is that when in doubt, just be nice to people. You have no idea what other people are going through, and I get more exposure to that than your average person, and kind of I end up sort of speed dating different people every half an hour and seeing and trying to help them in their means of struggle, and people from 9 to 90 years old, and everybody has their own little thing that either physically worries them, or a lot of particularly pain things is kind of a invisible sort of struggle that people are going through, and that's where it comes back to a mental health side of things. And a lot of times what you probably need yourself and the people around you need is just a bit of kindness. And so yeah, empathy.
Yeah, I love how Tim Ferriss always ends with, and until next time, just be a little kinder to others
Totally.
and to yourself. It's such a wonderful message. Where can people find you?
Probably the best is my website, which is whythingshurt.com. That's where most of my up-to-date information goes. I'm not wonderful on social media. I've been doing it a lot more lately, just with the book coming out, but I'd say I'm the most active on Instagram, which is at whythingshurt. I am on Twitter or X, same thing, at whythingshurt. I do have a Why Things Hurt Facebook page, which is just Facebook/Why Things Hurt. Yeah, if you type in Why Things Hurt, you'll find me and actually a pain specialist down in Australia called Lorimer Mosley. He did a TED Talk called Why Things Hurt. So yeah, you'll probably find me if you look up anything to do with Why Things Hurt.
And you look so young on the cover of Why Things Hurt. I don't know if I've ever seen you in real life without a beard. So that's a very interesting look for you. In the book we talked about today, Why We Hurt. So Go out, pick that up. Thank you, Brent, for joining me. Wonderful to have a conversation. And I will see you around the neighborhood shortly, my friend.
Sounds great. Thanks, Clint.
Cheers. If you like the podcast, you'll love our new newsletter, The Growth Guide. Every Thursday, straight to your inbox, with the goal to help you be better, achieve more, and become financially free. Check it out at our website, thegrowth.guide. Subscribe and learn more.